but we will go ahead and get started. We're really excited about today's presentation, all about navigating clinical trials. And as Jenny said, I'm Paige Humble. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Lung Cancer Initiative, and we really look forward to these opportunities to partner to deliver community education across the state and beyond with these virtual programs. Next slide, Savannah. And so we would not be able to do this program without our sponsors. So I just want to say a quick thank you to Genentech, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Pfizer, who made today's program possible and who support all of our community education programs. Next slide. So I'm just going to share a little bit about Lung Cancer Initiative if you're new to us, and invite you to reach out afterwards and let us know if you'd like to get more involved. Our mission is to advance survivorship and provide support to those affected by lung cancer through research, education, and access programs. Next slide. We are a small but mighty staff. We are based here in the Triangle area, and we do rely on the support of our volunteers and advocates across the state to carry out our mission. Next slide. And so this is our board of directors, and these leaders, again, they come from across the state of North Carolina, and they really amplify our efforts and allow us to reach multiple communities and carry out our mission. Next slide. And I'm just going to share a little bit about what we do. We really focus in several key areas: research, education, access, survivorship, and awareness. And everything that we do is about awareness, particularly with events like today. Next slide. And so as far as our research programming, to date, we've funded more than $2.8 million toward lung cancer research. And we have programs like our Research Fellowship Program that are designed to reach researchers earlier in their career in the hopes that they go on and receive greater funding. And our programming is mature enough now that we're seeing that happen, and that's incredibly exciting. And to date, we have funded 56 researchers through our programming. Next slide. And I mentioned our fellowship awards. We also have a career development grant, which is a larger award that we give one each year. And then we have innovation grants. And that's where we're really looking to fund research that's happening outside of academia and in community settings or in CROs and innovative research projects. Next slide. Community education programs like today are certainly fundamental to our mission, as is provider education. We do in-person provider education and online. We focus on kind of reaching out to specialists in the community setting, but also primary care. We work to raise awareness of lung cancer screening each year through the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians annual conference. And last year, we were able to reach more than 600 providers through that collaboration. Next slide. We also have access programs. We have our gas card program that's designed to help patients access appropriate care and treatment through the receipt of $50 gas cards. Patients can get up to 3 of those a year. We also have patient emergency funds. We recognize that with any cancer diagnosis, there's a financial burden. So these are designed to just support access to basic needs. And we also have our REACH grants, and we continue to look for partners, other nonprofit organizations that are doing something to facilitate access to education, to treatment, to research and clinical trials, and to screening. And I will make a plug very quickly. We still have REACH grants that we are looking to award this year. They're $10,000 grants, and we're certainly looking for partners for those grants this year. Next slide. We also have survivorship programming. This programming has evolved as we've had more of our survivors who are living longer, and they have different needs. So we have our lung cancer wellness retreat that happens each year. We just held that last month in September. We have networking luncheons, online opportunities for people to connect each month. Our next one is tomorrow, actually. And we also have a number of events where we celebrate survivorship, such as Cancer Survivors Day each June. Next slide. And this highlights our mentorship program, which we just launched this year. It's really designed to match survivors up, particularly newer diagnosed survivors or survivors who have particular needs, with survivors who are further along in their journey, in the hopes that they can make important connections. Matches are made on factors such as their age, biomarker groups, geographic location. We are currently looking for survivor mentors and mentees, individuals that would like to be matched with someone. So if you want to learn more, please reach out to myself or Jenny or Savannah after today's program, and we'd be happy to share more. Next slide. I mentioned some of our patient support. We also are partnering with another organization, Live Lung, in the Wilmington area for a new support group that was recently launched there. And I mentioned some of our other luncheons and retreats. We have a number of events across the state. On the next slide. And we have what's called Lunge Forwards. They're walks and runs in communities across the state. Our next Charlotte Lunge Forward is coming up in May, on May 20th of 2023 at McAlpin Creek Park. Our Triangle Lunge Forward just happened last month. We're actually planning for next year's event already. It's going to be on March 25th at Cocoa Amphitheater. And then this weekend, if you're in the Triad area, we have our Triad Lunge Forward 5K event. It's a timed 5K, but it's also a walk and a run, and it's going to be at Country Park, and we would love to have you join us if you're in that area. Next slide. We also have a golf tournament each year. This year's tournament is happening here in the Triangle area, and it's full, so that's exciting. We plan to offer this every year in the fall, so if golf is what you're into, certainly reach out to us and we can get you connected with this particular event. Next slide. We also have our Evening of Hope, and this year it's happening in Lung Cancer Awareness Month on November the 5th at Northridge Country Club, and it's really an evening of hope and celebration. It's a black tie optional event. It's just a nice chance to dress up and to connect with other people from across the lung cancer community. Next slide. And now for our program today, you are in for a treat with our panel of speakers who are going to talk all about navigating clinical trials. And I'm going to introduce each of them, and then they'll give their presentations, and then we will hold for questions at the end of all of their presentations. So first off, we have Dr. Ed Kim. Dr. Kim is Physician-in-Chief and Senior Vice President at City of Hope Orange County and Vice Physician-in-Chief and Professor at City of Hope National Medical Center. Dr. Kim joins City of Hope in fulfilling its promise of enhanced local access to cancer breakthroughs by leading its esteemed team of clinicians in Orange County. And Dr. Kim has long been a friend of Lung Cancer Initiative. He's a former board member and a member of our Scientific Advisory Committee. Next is Dr. Richard Town. Dr. Town is a PharmD graduate from the University of Buffalo's School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. Before joining the Antidote team, he gained patient engagement experience in several settings, including primary care, managed care, hospital, and community pharmacy. And last is Paul Hutter. Paul is age 67, has been a resident of North Carolina since 1986. He has lived in Raleigh since 1991. He's been married to his high school sweetheart, Sue, for 43 years. Paul was diagnosed with non-small cell lung cancer in early 2019, caused by a rare and difficult to treat EGFR exon 20 mutation. Since then, he has been fortunate to be able to enjoy a near normal life despite having stage 4 lung cancer. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to our speakers, and I believe Dr. Kim will be presenting first.
Great, thanks, Paige, and thanks for everyone who's here this morning. I'm now in the West Coast, and you miss a lot of friends and all the engagement that I had, but certainly it was a lot of great things that the Lung Cancer Initiative, that Paige and the others have really moved forward. And I think the organization, gosh, when I first engaged with you all, I mean, it was even before Paige got there, it was, is a different place, and now is really grown and helped influence a lot of folks and give those opportunities. And I'm going to speak on clinical trials. So I'm going to share my screen a bit. I'll share part of a presentation just to sort of give sort of a level set on lung cancer. I'm a lung cancer doc. I've been doing it for 20 plus years, and it's been really quite amazing to not only watch what's happened, especially in that field, but also across cancer. So let me share my screen here. Let's see if I can manage technology correctly. We're going to hope that it works. Okay. All right. Hopefully you can see my screen. Someone just nod their head or give a thumbs up. That's always a good thing. Okay. So, everyone talks about precision medicine and personalized medicine, and this has evolved over time. But what's really been great is to see that we are moving toward trying to be as precise as we can for each individual person. And we have not only a sharing of data with both tissue testing and blood testing, but also with companies and developing new molecules. Immunotherapy has changed everything in the space of lung cancer for a lot of folks. Less chemotherapy being used, and obviously that has to go with clinical trials hand in hand. And the bottom result is that more people are living longer with cancer and better, and that's equally important, right? We don't want just years; we want life to be injected to those years as well. So just to give a sort of the state of where we've been and where we're going, if I go back to 2005. Everything centered around who is eligible for chemotherapy. And chemotherapy was pretty toxic back then. Chemotherapy's gotten a lot better now than it was back then. And so even if 100 people showed up, who had lung cancer, only 80 of those 100 would be eligible to receive chemotherapy. So 20 right off the bat were said, we couldn't do anything for you. And then even if out of those 80, if we gave the chemotherapy, the shrinkage rate of shrinking the actual nodules and the cancer was only about 15 to 20%. So we did not shrink tumors in most of the cases. Now, this is indicative of it. This is a New England paper that was published in 2001, and it was about 4 different chemotherapy regimens. And you can see those with a cisplatin or carboplatin with the various drugs. And this is the curve. No difference in survival. So it didn't matter if you got the first drug, second drug, third drug, fourth drug. The take-home message was use whatever you want. And different side effects affect people differently. So good luck. And I remember that when this was first presented, I was just finishing up my fellowship. And, I remember talking with a couple of my other young fellows, and we were like, we got to change this. This is terrible. And this is what's being highlighted at the national meetings by folks. And we have to set a new standard here. So it has changed. If we look fast forward now to 2022, we've found these mutations that exist. And you can see in a subset of folks, we'll find those 15 to 20% of the time, including expanding additional mutations that have, and what's important is it's not just the science, it's the fact that we have drugs that are FDA approved that match up to these specific mutations. ALK is another subset that we've found, 6 to 8% of folks. You also see ROS1 that exists there. I remember when the first debate about ROS1 as a marker came up, and people were saying, oh, it's only found 1% of the time, 1 in 100. And I said, wow, if those were lotto odds, you would take that in a second. So why would we not test for ROS1? And so that was added to the panel. And then so on. We've had other markers that like PDL1 that everybody said was not a very useful marker, but still has lasted the test of time so far. BRAF, which was first described in melanoma and now and had been sort of dabbled with in colon cancer, but is now has therapeutics in lung. RET fusions, most recently have shown up. MET exon 14. And then NTRK, again, these are even lower than 1%, but they exist. And we have 2 therapies that target NTRK fusions. And then most recently, KRAS G12C. So, when you start doing the math and looking at the number of people who may actually be a candidate for targeted therapy, we have to continue to do molecular testing, genomic testing on any person who comes in with a lung cancer. And more importantly, of not just doing the testing, but actually waiting for those test results and using them, utilizing that knowledge to direct the therapy. And I think because of logistical issues and maybe, awareness aspects, it's not 100% of people who are getting that. We've seen data where it's in the 70% range, and it has to be higher than that. We tried to pioneer some things back in 2007 in my old days at MD Anderson, and this was called the Battle Study. And it was appropriate because it was a Department of Defense grant, and we got 20 million of taxpayer dollar to try and change the world in lung cancer. And what we did was we proposed that in people who were being treated with chemotherapy for their lung cancer, that after the chemotherapy stopped working, that we wanted to repeat the biopsy done on the actual cancer, and then test for a certain set of markers. And after testing for those markers, use that information to randomize to one of 4 different treatment arms. Now, this should sound like the blueprint of every, precision medicine study that's done today, I-SPY, multiple others. But back then, it was 2006, 2007. There were no markers for lung cancer that were FDA approved. These therapies were not approved based on a marker. And the fact that we wanted to repeat a biopsy in a patient who already had a diagnosis, we were called unethical. The IRB actually said we were unethical for wanting to repeat a biopsy in a person after chemotherapy stopped working. So you can see even the number of hurdles that we've had to cross just to advance the science. And we were very successful in this study. It was a 254 patients enrolled in less than 3 years. And it established the feasibility of being able to repeat biopsies and run biomarkers in patients who were being treated for lung cancer. And so, again, a little blip on the screen. We published it in 2011, but it changed how we approached clinical trial design. And now, as you can see, there are a lot of boxes here of lung cancer and the number of therapies and the number of biomarkers that have been approved and tested. And it's unbelievable. And now we're moving into the earlier stages of lung cancer, which is even more gratifying. And if you think about a tumor like breast cancer, and I would be remiss to not mention that this is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, so, wear your pink proudly. This is a field where they've used HER2 and ERPR hormone status for years, and those have been reflexively done to direct the type of treatment. So, and that was tamoxifen was a drug that was first tested in the late stage setting, and as its efficacy and safety were developed, it got moved into the earlier stages And so that's what we're doing with lung cancer finally, is taking these late stage drugs and moving them into the earlier stages. And then kind of highlighting why clinical trials are very important. It is the opportunity that we give when there is no standard of care. And what I preach quite a bit, and I do this at City of Hope all the time right now, even it's a top 10 academic center. It's, if we are practicing the standard of care, then we are behind, because the new standard of care is what we're doing in clinical trials, right? That's why we have them, is that down the road, we're going to have a new standard. And that's how it should be. We shouldn't be doing things we were doing 10 years ago, because that means we haven't innovated enough. And, this is the late Senator McCain, and, he had multiple bouts with cancer and was treated, and there was a very big advocate for clinical trials, and obviously a war hero, POW, all that. So this is the sad part about clinical trials in cancer in the United States. This is 19 out of 20 patients will not be eligible for a clinical trial. And this has been something that has been a big issue that I've raised over the years with multiple others. The question is, you can talk about stuff and it doesn't change, or you got to do stuff. And so what we did was we published this paper in JCO in 2015. It was not a landmark paper or anything like that. It was on a subcommittee and an ASCO committee. So normally you don't publish papers out of that, but we approached it in a manner that we wanted to do the work and show others what we did so that there could be dialogue. And the best thing that happened about this paper was that the Friends of Cancer Research, this really big advocacy organization across the country, saw this paper. And they said, you know what, we're interested in clinical trial eligibility too. So they reached out to ASCO. Next thing you know, this is, the committee I had here. You can see there's about 10 people. Next thing we had about 120 people. And so we released in 2017 the first recommended changes to clinical trial eligibility. Now, why is that important? There's about 37, a median number of 37 eligibility criteria that exist in a clinical protocol. And that means 37 checklists of somebody that have to go through before they can be eligible for a trial. And that's wrong, because now we're excluding people. And so we looked at, why is the minimum age 18 for an adult clinical trial, right? Who said 18 was the physiologic age of an adult? Last I checked, girls could get their menses around 12, 13. Your liver, your kidneys, they excrete drugs or metabolize drugs like an adult at age 12. If you go to a children's Tylenol at Walgreens and look in the dosing, what does it say? It gives you dosing up to what age? 12, because at 12, you're an adult. So why would we exclude people who are 15 years old that have late stage cancer and they don't have access to the adult trial population, because those are the trials that innovate. So we made changes there. We also looked at, why is it that, if you had a stage 1 prostate cancer 10 years ago that you're cured from, that you couldn't enroll in a clinical trial because no history of prior cancer? That doesn't make any sense. That's a cured disease. And so that was incongruent. HIV, if you had a history of HIV, it didn't have anything to do with the science or whether HIV interfered with the drug or anything. You were excluded automatically with no science behind it. And people who have HIV live exactly the same length as a healthy person for 5 years. So the 5-year survivals are exactly the same. And then, if your brain was affected because of your disease, a lot of those folks were excluded, and that's 20-30% of the population. So it didn't make a lot of sense. We're just trying to make things that make sense. So we did that, and then we further did a second round because it was so successful. We made changes and recommended them, and now we published another set of papers, and those came out, and it was looking at washout periods. Why should washout periods dictate whether you can get on a trial or not? This is not how we would do standard clinical practice. And again, looking at other analyses that were done, prior therapies, performance status, so really, and reference ranges of labs. So we made all these changes. And the beautiful thing about these changes is that the FDA accepted them, and so did the NCI. And they changed the protocol template that existed. Then they did an analysis. Don Harvey reported this and looked at if there were 3 or more traditional criteria, who would be excluded. And almost 50% of people coming through the door would be excluded. So you could theoretically improve your eligibility, number of patients who could be eligible for studies, by almost 50% if you excluded even just 3 traditional criteria. So that's always been the disconnect. And so this has always been the paradox of treatment, right? Is that, 1 in 20 are eligible for a clinical trial. Then when the drug's approved, we give it to almost everyone. So is that really the real world population that we're testing? And so we're trying to, fight those types of things. And so hopefully this gives you some insight into, what we're thinking about clinical trials, where we're trying to go, and the things that, the reason why we can innovate into the clinic. So I'll pause there and see if there's any questions or if we want to move on. All right. Well, who wants to go next? There's Jenny.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Yeah, we will move on now to Dr. Town. If you want to go ahead, and you can either pull up your slides or we can pull them up for you.
I'll pull them up right now.
Okay, thanks.
Let me find it. Share my screen. Can everyone see that?
No.
Okay. Oh, no screen? Let me see.
Not yet.
Yeah, no screen.
There we go.
Yes.
There it is. Okay, perfect. All right. So I'll go through my presentation about clinical trials and how to find one, and generally give a background of clinical trials and what patients need to know. So a bit about me. Like it was said in the introduction, I went to pharmacy school and worked all over the healthcare field, hospitals, specifically pediatrics, primary care, managed care. And what I really thought was the most interesting and the biggest unmet need for patients was clinical trials. So with Antidote, we are a patient engagement agency, and we really help to improve patient access to clinical trials through the use of our match journey, which hopefully I have a little bit of time to go through later. So the question is, what is a clinical trial? The NIH says it's a research study in which one or more human subjects are assigned to one or more treatments, which may or may not include placebo or another control, to evaluate the effects of those treatments and health-related outcomes. So basically, it hasn't always been like this, though. We go to the history of clinical trials. 1747, James Lind was the first ever researcher that thought, if I want to figure out if something works, maybe I'll try a couple different things. And he tried orange juice, apple cider vinegar. I think he tried some sort of soap, and ended up finding that orange juice and vitamin C in general is the treatment for scurvy. 1863, the first ever placebo was used, just to see there's such a strong placebo effect, where they want to make sure that if a treatment is improved, that basically it's doing more than a flour pill in a significant way. First ever randomized clinical controlled trial took place in 1946. What's really interesting to note is that this is relatively recent that these clinical trials are even being tried for the first time. 1960, 1970, the FDA started to notice that there needed to be more regulations around clinical trials, making sure that patients are protected, and I'll get into that later, and just other sort of regulations that streamline the process for people that want to conduct a clinical trial. In 1997, clinicaltrials.gov was introduced by the FDA Modernization Act. And as recently as 2021, clinicaltrials.gov is still being worked on, and beta.clinicaltrials.gov is introduced. And I've personally got a couple issues with clinicaltrials.gov that I'll go into later. So beyond all this, why are clinical trials conducted? The reason is you want to determine whether new drugs, diagnostics, and treatments are both safe and effective. And that's mainly for an interventional trial, but most trials are going to be the interventional type to see, if these drugs, diagnostic, and treatments can be both safe and effective for patients. So here's a couple reasons why clinical trials are conducted. And beyond just that definition before, the interventions, finding ways to prevent the initial development or recurrence of a disease or a condition, looking at diagnostics. For a diagnostic device or test to be approved, it needs to actually be shown to be accurate. Examining methods for identifying a condition or even risk factors for the condition. That's more of an observational study. And then exploring and measuring ways to improve the quality of life through supportive care for people with a chronic illness. So this is all the way from treatment to cure, prevention to symptom management. There's a lot of different things that clinical trials look at. It's not always just a drug that's designed to treat symptoms. It can be all across that spectrum. So there are several different types of clinical trials. They are not all the same. The first is that feasibility studies are designed to see if it's possible to do the main study. Pilot studies, those are very, very small studies that are small scale versions. And that's trying to make sure that for a massive trial, each individual small part works correctly. Prevention trials, like I mentioned, help prevent. Screening trials is looking to see if we can diagnose things earlier and accurately. This was huge for COVID with a lot of the COVID screening tests. Observational trials is where you're going to be looking at measurements in large groups of participants that aren't getting a treatment. They're just being followed in their everyday care. And lastly, there are such things as phases for these treatment trials. And those are the ones that get the most publicity. The earliest phase determines whether or not the drug is safe in a healthy group of volunteers or maybe a small group of people with a condition, all the way up to the final phases where it's looking at the drug in a larger population of patients. determine if it's safe, effective, and non-inferior to other products on the market, if there are any. So here's a really, really helpful graph on the different phases of the clinical trial. You can see phase 1 right here is just, like I said, evaluating safety, determining safe dosage, and identifying side effects. About 70% of drugs pass this phase. Phase 2, this is where you're going to start looking at more patients. And this is to start looking, is it effective? And also just making sure that with this larger sample size and group of patients, that the safety factors are taken care of. What's really interesting is only 33% of drugs pass phase 2. Phase 3, this is the final one before a drug can get approved by the FDA. And about 25 to 30% of drugs move on to the next phase. This is the most strict. This is confirming effectiveness versus standard of care placebo. Once again, monitoring side effects and safety, comparing it to other treatments on the market. Like I said, treatments need to be non-inferior, which means that for a treatment to be approved, it can't work less well than an existing product on the market, and just to collect more information. So phase 1 through 3, that's collecting as much information as possible on what dosages are effective, what side effects are present, and if it actually works. After the drug is approved by the FDA, means it's available for patients to have it prescribed to them. And phase 4 trials then take place, which is looking at the long-term side effects. And this also can be, this is just a final check. This is a massive group of patients, and this helps to detect those ultra rare side effects. So who sponsors clinical trials? That can be anyone from pharmaceutical companies, academic medical centers, voluntary groups, and other organizations such as patient advocacy groups, the NIH, Department of Defense, Department of Veteran Affairs. And what's actually interesting is doctors can also, and individuals in general can sponsor their own clinical studies. And those are usually much smaller than these massive phased clinical trials, but they do exist. So who's involved with a clinical study? Every clinical study is led by a principal investigator who's most often a medical doctor, but it can be a variety of different professions. The research team is really comprehensive. That might include doctors, nurses, social workers to make sure patients are able to get to the site correctly and address other life needs that they have. And there's other healthcare professionals, like usually like me, a pharmacist involved in the dispensing of the study drug. Where our clinical studies held, that can take place in many locations, not just in hospitals. It can happen in universities, doctors' offices, community clinics. And this is really going to depend on who's holding the study. Most large trials will have anywhere to 300 to 400 sites, though some trials might just have one single site. So part of the presentation is, how do patients know if they qualify for a clinical trial? And this is often done in conjunction with the patient's healthcare professional or medical provider who's going to know the patient's condition really well. Like Dr. Kim said, they can be these inclusion-exclusion criteria can be really strict. So, the factors allow someone to participate, inclusion, the factors that disqualify, exclusion. And what goes into the development of these inclusion-exclusion criteria are age, gender, type, and stage of disease, previous treatment history, other medical conditions. And sometimes it can even get more granular than that, molecular aberrations, washout period of certain drugs, and there can be a whole host of things there. So one of the things is, how are patients protected during clinical trials? Recently, there's been a lot of questioning over, are clinical trials safe? Are investigational drugs safe? What is the regulation around protecting patients from, signing up for an investigational drug? The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, as well as what's called an IRB, Institutional Review Board Service. When a protocol is developed, the IRB and FDA will work to make sure that patients are aware of what's going to happen in the trial, what procedures are there, what risks are there, what benefits are there, what other options are there. And this is going to allow people to decide whether they want to enroll in the study. And people can also withdraw their consent later in the study and decline to keep on participating. And like I said, this is just meant to make sure that the minimum necessary is that patients understand the risk, potential benefits of, and also alternatives to the study. So how can patients find out about clinical trials for them? Well, there's a couple different options. There's the NIH and also partner groups like the LCI. I'll jump now to clinicaltrials.gov quickly. Can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Perfect. So if you go into clinicaltrials.gov, and let's just take a broad search of lung cancer, you can see there's a lot of different options here. Some of these keywords are a bit scrambled and it's not very unified. It can be a little bit confusing. Do I click metastatic lung cancer, stage 4 lung cancer, non-small cell with a hyphen, non-small cell stage 4 without a hyphen? But for just the sake of this, I'm going to hit lung cancer, pick the United States. I'm from the city of Buffalo, so let me just do 50 miles. And this is going to be what shows up. There's about 59 studies. That's a lot of studies to look through. And if you actually go into the study, on the first page here, you can see where the location is, what intervention is being treated, what the condition is, and what the study title is. And once you go into here, this is actually a lot of information. And this is really more targeted towards healthcare professionals. It can be a little bit much for patients, where you can see a brief summary, study design, the different arms and intervention, the outcome measures, and all the way at the bottom here is where the eligibility criteria are. And you can see that this is a bit much, lots of stuff, like Dr. Kim said, and a little bit outside the scope of my presentation. Whether or not some of these need to necessarily be in here is up for debate, but this is a lot for people to scroll through. And as you can see, if you want to go through all 59, you might have to go through all of them. So that's why Antidote, our proprietary match tool, we've taken this information and we make this a little more friendly for patients. And this is going to be a journey that we are about to push live to patients soon. But are you able to see this page that says, for which condition are you looking to find a clinical trial? Hopefully. Let me just go into here. Just need to refresh real quick. And so what our tool does is it now allows you to do a more streamlined approach to looking for a clinical trial. First question is, for whom are you looking to find a trial? The patient can either take it for themselves, it can be taken by a healthcare provider or a caregiver. This someone else button will just change the verb tense from you to they. Where are you looking to find? I'm going to do Buffalo again. How far are you willing to travel? And you can see we have a couple more options in clinicaltrials.gov, all the way from 10 miles, only give me the closest, to any distance. Like I will travel anywhere, go anywhere. That's what we'll do. But for the sake of this, we'll do 60. We're going to get an age, 65, female. And you can see on the right, that's our current trial list. We can jump to that at any time. And there's an option right here, totally optional, for wanting personalized trial alerts. If you put your email in there, if there's a trial that matches, you'll get an email saying that a trial may be available based on that distance you set and the other answers you put in. We have a race and ethnicity question. This is totally optional. This can sometimes be tied into the inclusion-exclusion criteria of clinical trials looking at specific population. And our first question we'll do you currently have cancer? For the sake of this, we'll say yes. And this is where Match will start looking at the different inclusion-exclusion criteria and then pull out the correct trials that match. So we'll say we have non-small cell lung cancer. We have the stage option. And on every question, we have I don't know and skip. If the answer is known, this will then filter based on it. So let's say arbitrarily we have stage 4. You can see that that jumps down to 66 now. If you have any of the following molecular expressions - mutations, Dr. Kim talked about these two. You know that you have one, let's say this EGFR mutation. I can see it jumps down to 55. Have patients received any of the following treatments? If patients know that they've had one of these, you can also I don't know or skip. If patients plan to receive any of the following treatments, what their doctors discussed with them. And then finally, we have a big comorbidity question. that asks if any of these following conditions that are common exclusion criteria, the patient knows that they have them, all the way from hepatitis, some of these common bloodborne diseases, to another cancer being treated or brain metastases. And this sometimes is actually inclusionary for trials. For example, looking at brain metastases. If you click that, if you don't click that, it will filter out trials without brain metastases. So if we clicked on the above, now you get a list. And from here, this is the 52 trials. You can filter by phase, filter by study type. And when you click on one, it actually shows you what the trial's for, what the intervention is being studied, the purpose. In this case, it's a treatment trial by Sanofi, looking for 36 people. And you can scroll down here. This is what it looked at with the inclusion exclusion criteria. This is the same thing from clinicaltrials.gov, directly pulls from there. If you search for this NCT, it will pull up the clinicaltrials.gov page itself. And the final thing down here is it will actually tell you which site. So if I click this, this is going to be Roswell Park, which is the big cancer center near Buffalo. And patients can put in their email, and it will actually email them the details to participate in that study, or at least get in touch with the site staff to arrange a screening. So with that, tried to get through my slides relatively quickly. Are there any questions right now, or I can pass it off to Paul, I believe. All right, thank you.
Yep, thank you, Paul. If you want to go ahead and jump in.
Sure. I actually was very interested in those two prior topics. They're very helpful to me. So let me introduce myself. I'm Paul Hutter. I'm 67 years old, and as I was introduced, I married my high school sweetheart and remained married to her 43 years later. We have 3 grown married daughters. We have 3 grandchildren now, all girls. And just this weekend, I heard that we have another grandchild on the way. Now, I'm going to ask you to keep that quiet because that, I was told, has not been published yet. So that's between the people in this group, that there's a new grandchild on the way. I was first diagnosed with stage 3 non-small cell lung cancer in early 2019. Prior to my diagnosis, I was fit. I thought I was healthy. I was a never smoker, and I had no symptoms. My daily routine was to wake up. I'd go to our local YMCA. I'd exercise religiously, get showered, and then go off to my day of work. And I did that for years. At the same time, my wife was going to the Y, and she began taking spin classes, those stationary bicycle classes. And she came home and said, Paul, I think you should do those. They run them in the morning, and I think you'd really like them. And I for one reason or another, I was not really into that. But eventually, like all good husbands, I listened to her. And I took my spin classes, and she was absolutely right. I got hooked on them. I loved them. And the reason why I loved them is they had just put in new bicycles into the bike room. And in the front of the room was an electronic leaderboard. And I don't know if you know about that, but today they have the technology where you can actually, your results can be projected onto a screen in front. And you can see how your performance compares to everybody else in the class. And I had a big ego at the time, and I was 64 years old then. And I was typically at the top of the leaderboard. And my poor wife, she would have to listen to me come home every night and tell her how well I beat all the young guys in the class. Like all of us, I'm sure, my diagnosis of lung cancer came as a complete shock. We were devastated. It was found incidental to another routine medical test. a 6 centimeter mass was seen in the lower right lobe of my right lung. That mass soon became a malignant tumor, and my cancer journey was off and running. Because of the size of the tumor and some nearby lymph node involvement, I was given adjuvant chemotherapy and radiation. And fortunately, I tolerated those treatments very well, and I began my new normal life. I went back to work full time. I started going back to the Y. I did not go back to the spin classes, and it's not because I couldn't. I just couldn't bear the thought of not being at the top of the leaderboard anymore. So soon after my surgery, I remember my oncologist telling us that she had ordered genetic testing on a sample of my tumor. And she went on to say that there were treatments becoming available for different genetic mutations and immunotherapies. So I was hopeful I would be one of the lucky ones who had that. A few weeks later, my genetic report came back, and it said I had an EGFR mutation. And when I first heard that, I was pleased, I was happy, because I had read that there were treatments for EGFR mutations, but unfortunately, my oncologist so kindly informed me that I had an exon 20 insertion mutation, which was fairly rare, and it was resistant to all of the treatments for EGFR. So that was concerning, but at the time it didn't overly worry me too much, because I was NED at that time, no evidence of disease, and there was no treatment needed. And while I always knew that my cancer could return, I was hopeful that I would be one of the fortunate people where it didn't, but that turned out not to be true. In September of 2020, 18 months after my initial diagnosis, my regular CT scan showed a big change. I had a pleural effusion. I had lymph node enlargement. I had a lesion outside of my lung. And this came with a stage 4 cancer diagnosis, and obviously the need to treat my now stage 4 cancer. As I said earlier, I live in Raleigh, and I think we're fortunate here. We have 2 major cancer centers. We have Duke University and the Lineberger Cancer Institute at UNC. So within a few days of getting my BAD scan, I saw my oncologist, and we discussed a treatment plan. And to be quite honest, at the time, the treatment plan was not what we had hoped for. And realistically, we knew it wasn't going to effectively control my cancer, most likely. So we walked out of the hospital that day, and before we actually made it into our car, my wife and I decided that I needed a second opinion. And I contacted, while sitting in the car in the parking lot, an oncologist, a thoracic oncologist I had seen at Duke early in my cancer journey, to see if I could get an appointment to see him. And lo and behold, I was very surprised to be able to find out that I could get an appointment the next morning, and I was thrilled at that. So I thought things might be looking up, but that was short-lived. because when I met with him and he reviewed my case, the options that he provided me were probably no more promising than the day before. So over the course of the 2 days, I had seen 2 prominent oncologists and really had not much hope. The drive home from Duke took about 20 minutes. By the time I got home, I remembered that there was a group, it's the Exon 20 group, it's called, and it's an organization that is there to help people with Exon 20 disease. They have a Facebook page, and I'm not a Facebook user. I never have been, but I thought this would be the time to see what's going on with them. And I found their Facebook page, and just coincidentally, that very same morning, they posted a paper that had just been published, and it was the preliminary results of a stage 1 clinical trial for medicine that was intended to treat exon 20. And the results were promising. There were only 17 patients that were reported in the study, but all during the study period had remained stable. And to me, that was the best news I had heard in some time. So that excited me because that gave me hope. I immediately looked up where the clinical trial was held. So I went to the clinicaltrial.gov website that Richard described, and I looked it up, and I was hopeful that there would be a trial site convenient to me. And the closest trial site that I found, and I felt fortunate to find, was in Fairfax, Virginia, which is about a 4 to 4.5 hour drive from my home up I-95. So some days it could be 6 hours if you know I-95, but that was doable. So that same afternoon, I got home from Duke about 2. I found the trial about 3. And by 3:30, I was emailing the principal investigator at the Fairfax site to see if they had openings in the trial and if I might be eligible. So within 15 minutes, I received an email back. It said, yes, we do have an opening, and that he would like his assistant to schedule a telephone conference with me the next morning to talk about the course of my disease and if I might be eligible. So the next morning I got on that teleconference call, and I felt like I was on a job interview because probably the most important job interview I'd ever been on in my life. I wanted to be on my best behavior. By the end of our conversation, it did seem that I would be eligible, and I was hopeful. But then, as was mentioned before, there are so many criteria that have to be met and proven, and I had to provide so many of my medical records. It took 6 weeks, and when the stage 4 cancer clock is ticking, 4 years is an eternity. It really wasn't until the night before I was scheduled to travel to Fairfax that I officially knew that I was enrolled in the clinical trial. And that was a very tough period going through that. Well, on October 27th of 2020, I did start that clinical trial. And now, nearly 2 years later, I'm still in it. It's for a targeted medicine. It's in pill form, so I take pills in the morning and pills in the evening. And it's worked very well for me. I've had a good response to it. My tumor load has shrunk. My pleural effusion disappeared. And I've had virtually, I've had no new metastases, and most surprisingly, no side effects. Many of the TKIs have pretty severe side effects, as you well know, and I've had none. So I've been able to live a very near normal life for 2 years, and I'm very, very grateful for that. I no longer go to the YMCA anymore, but it's not because of my lung cancer. When COVID came along, the YMCA actually closed, like many gyms did. And we were fortunate to have a shed on our property that we converted into a gym. My daughter bought us a Peloton, and we have become full-fledged Peloton cult members. For those of you who are familiar at all with Pelotons, you know it is a cult. You put two people together, that Peloton, and that's all they will talk about. And I will admit, I am certainly one of those. I am no longer the top of my leaderboard anymore, but it's not because my performance has suffered. It's my competition has gotten better. I now compete against hundreds, if not thousands, of people around the world, but I still finish in the top 20% of all people, and probably the top 10% for my age group. So it's my ego is still pretty high. I'm happy about that. For those of you who do Peloton, my rider name is TOG54. That stands for Tough Old Guy and my birth year. And I ride under the hashtag of living with lung cancer. So in conclusion, I have to say I'm very thankful to be here today. The medicine that I found through my clinical trial has given me a life where I wake up each morning feeling good. I feel healthy. It has allowed me to see be there for the birth of my granddaughters. They know me as Granddad. I hope to be here in April when my new grandchild is born. I've been able to body surf and snorkel in the ocean, swim with manta rays in Hawaii. I've hiked extinct volcanoes in Iceland. I just returned a week ago from a bike trip with friends of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, something I had always wanted to do. So I've been very fortunate to have all of these special times and special memories. And if it were not for me finding that clinical trial after coming home from my visit with my oncologist, I'm not sure I would have had the opportunity to do that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you to all of our presenters. I know we are to time, and I want to be sensitive to everybody's time. Were there any burning questions? Jenny, did we have any questions come through? I'll say if you have a burning question and you didn't get it answered, please send it to us and we will reach out to our speakers and see if we can get some feedback for you. But we just really appreciate it. Dr. Kim, I really appreciate what you shared, and particularly around the barriers and the work that you've done, the barriers to clinical research. Dr. Town, I had never really heard the history of how clinical trials started. So that was really interesting, and appreciate you walking through the tools that you shared. And Paul, thank you so much for sharing your story and how you have benefited from clinical research. I think as an organization, we continue to look for ways, how do we continue to encourage patients to look at clinical research. And so if anyone on this call has any thoughts about that, we'd love to connect with you because we want to continue to do programs like this. We do have another community education program coming up in person in the Charlotte area on November 10th. So you're on our mailing list now, so you'll be getting information about that very soon. We did video today's talk, so we'll be sending the link out to everyone. We encourage you to share it in your networks, and we'll be sharing it on our YouTube page and in our publications as well. Thank you again to our presenters. Thank you so much to all of our attendees, and we hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.